Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into one of the most influential works in Western philosophy, Plato's Republic.
Ah, yes, the Republic.
I know you're interested in ideas about justice and how societies are structured.
Yeah,
And, well, maybe even a little curious about this whole idea of philosophers ruling the world.
definitely a thought-provoking concept.
So we're going to unpack Plato's vision, analyze its strengths and weaknesses, and see what we can learn from it.
Sounds like a plan. It's an incredibly relevant text, even though it was written over 2,400 years ago in ancient Greece.
Yeah, to really appreciate it, we need to understand the context.
Exactly. I mean, ancient Greece wasn't all just togas and philosophy. It was a time of immense political upheaval.
Right. Athens, Plato's home city, was known for its democracy.
But it was also a system riddled with instability and prone to corruption.
And then, of course, there was the execution of Socrates, Plato's teacher, for challenging the status quo.
It really makes you think about why Plato might have been searching for a better way to organize society.
So it wasn't just theoretical musing. The Republic was born out of a very real sense of crisis.
Absolutely. And Plato was essentially asking, how can we create a society that is truly just and stable?
And he chose a very interesting format to explore this question.
You mean the fact that the entire book is written as a dialogue?
Exactly.
Yes. Imagine a group of intellectuals gathered, debating the big questions of the day.
Like a philosophical symposium.
That's essentially what you're telling about that. The Republic is a conversation primarily led by Socrates where different perspectives are presented and challenged.
It's not a straightforward treatise.
It's more like an invitation to think critically.
And one of the first things he challenges is Athenian democracy itself.
That's right.
I mean, even Plato's own cousin, Critias, became a leader of the 30 tyrants.
Oh, wow. The brutal oligarchy that briefly ruled Athens.
Exactly. Plato had seen firsthand how democracy could falter, how it could be manipulated and corrupted.
But he wasn't simply advocating for a Spartan-style system, was he?
No, which was notoriously strict and militaristic.
Mm.
So if not democracy, and not a Spartan oligarchy, what was Plato proposing?
Well, he constructs this ideal city called the Republic.
It's a thought experiment, right?
Exactly. It's not a blueprint that he expects to be followed literally.
More of a way to explore what a truly just and functional society might look like.
Exactly. And he starts with the very basics.
So we're talking food, shelter, security,
Yeah.
the building blocks of any civilization.
Precisely. And from those basic needs, Plato argues that specialization naturally arises.
You need farmers to grow food, builders to construct homes, and warriors to defend the city.
Exactly.
It's logical. You can't have everyone sitting around discussing philosophy if nobody's taking care of the practical necessities.
Right, and this leads to Plato's idea of a class-based society.
Producers, warriors, and rulers.
Yes, but here's where it gets really interesting. Because for Plato, the ideal rulers weren't just politicians or military leaders.
They were philosopher kings.
Yeah.
I mean, even today it sounds kind of radical.
Or even impractical.
Can you imagine a world where philosophers are calling the shots?
Well, it's not as outlandish as it might seem. Plato had very specific reasons for believing that philosophers were best equipped to lead.
And it all goes back to his theory of forms.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit.
Sure.
The theory of forms can be a little abstract.
It can.
What's the essence of it?
Imagine a world where everything we see and experience is just a shadow, just a pale imitation of a higher, truer reality.
Okay.
That's the core of Plato's theory of forms. He believed that there are perfect, unchanging forms, things like justice, beauty, truth, that exist beyond the physical world.
So the world we experience with our senses is like a movie projected onto a screen.
Yes,
And the forms are the actual film reel.
that's a great analogy. And for Plato, true knowledge isn't about grasping those shadows, It's about understanding the forms themselves.
Okay, got it.
And who better to guide society towards truth and justice than those who can see beyond the shadows?
The philosophers. Because they're the ones who are trained to contemplate these higher truths.
They're driven by reason and a desire to understand the essence of things, not personal gain or ambition.
And Plato argued that only those who can perceive the forms can truly understand what justice is.
And what makes a society truly good, and how to lead it toward its highest potential.
But isn't that creating a sort of elite class?
It's a fair point.
And how do we even identify these philosopher kings? I mean, we've all encountered people who think they have all the answers, but
That's a valid point, and it's one of the potential downsides of Plato's system. How do you select these philosopher kings? How do you prevent them from becoming corrupt or tyrannical? And what about the rest of society? Do they have no say in how things are run? These are all questions that Plato tries to address in the Republic.
And I'm sure we'll dive into those questions further.
We will.
But before we do, I'd love to get a clearer picture of what life in this ideal republic would actually look like.
Oh, okay.
Who are these guardians that Plato talks about so much?
The guardians are the warrior class and, most importantly, the philosopher kings.
Okay.
And Plato had some very specific and, some might say radical ideas about how they should live.
Radical in what way?
Well, think about what might motivate someone to seek power,
Wealth.
wealth, status, personal gain.
Right.
So Plato argued that to truly serve the common good, the guardians should renounce these very things.
Oh, wow.
He proposed that they should live communally, share everything, and have no private property.
Whoa, communal living for the ruling class. That's quite a concept. And I'm guessing it wasn't exactly a popular idea, even back then.
You're right, it was incredibly radical, even for ancient Greece. But Plato believed that private wealth inevitably leads to greed, corruption, and, a focus on personal gain rather than the well-being of the entire city.
So no fancy villas or Swiss bank accounts for these philosopher kings. They're living a life of, maybe not Spartan austerity.
But certainly simplicity.
Exactly. Plato believed that by removing the distractions of wealth and material possessions, the guardians would be free to focus solely on their duty,
To rule wisely and justly.
guided by reason and a deep understanding of the forms.
Precisely.
But it sounds like Plato went even further than just communal living. Didn't he also propose abolishing family for the guardians?
He did, and this is probably the most controversial aspect of his entire vision. Plato believed that family ties would create divided loyalties.
And that a guardian's ultimate allegiance should be to the state.
To the common good.
No families. I mean, that's certainly challenging conventional wisdom. It goes against our most deeply held beliefs about love, belonging.
And individual freedom.
Exactly.
Plato was essentially saying that to create a truly just society, you have to prioritize the needs of the whole over the desires of the individual.
It's a debate that continues to this day. How do we balance individual liberty with the needs of the community?
That's the question.
It's incredible how an idea from over 2,000 years ago can still feel so relevant to our lives today. This idea of balancing personal freedom with the common good. It's something we grapple with constantly.
Absolutely. And it's just one of the many thought-provoking dilemmas that Plato raises in the Republic.
We've seen how he critiques Athenian democracy, proposes philosopher kings as rulers, and advocates for a radical lifestyle for the guardians.
It's quite the vision.
But I think it's time we explore the heart of Plato's argument, his definition of justice itself.
Absolutely.
Because understanding how Plato defines justice is key to understanding his entire vision for the Republic.
Couldn't agree more.
So we've been exploring some pretty radical ideas in Plato's Republic.
I have. Philosopher kings, communal living, no families for the guardians.
It's a lot to take in.
It is.
Yeah.
But it all comes back to this central argument about justice, right?
The whole point of this ideal city is to create a truly just society.
Exactly. And for Plato, justice isn't just about laws and punishments.
It's about something more.
Much deeper. Harmony. Both within the individual and within the city.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What did he mean by harmony?
Well, he believed that the human soul has three parts: reason, spirit, and desire.
Okay.
Think of reason as the part of us that seeks truth and knowledge.
Okay.
Spirit as the part that's courageous, ambitious.
Right.
And desire as the part that's driven by, our basic appetites and wants.
So reason is like the wise judge, spirit is the fiery warrior, and desire is the
Your
beer.
party animal.
Aha, exactly.
And for Plato, justice within the individual occurs when these three parts are in harmony, when reason is guiding the way.
It's like a chariot.
Yes, with reason as the charioteer holding the reins of spirit and desire, making sure they're working together towards a common goal.
So a just person is someone who's in control of their emotions and desires, guided by reason.
Right.
But how does this apply to an entire city?
He uses an analogy. He says that a just city is like a well-ordered soul, where each part is fulfilling its proper function. Remember the three classes we talked about?
The producers, the warriors, and the rulers.
Yes. The farmers, the soldiers, and the philosopher kings.
Right.
Each class represents one of the parts of the soul.
So the producers represent desire.
Desire, focused on fulfilling those basic needs.
The warriors.
Represent spirit, courageously defending the city.
And the rulers.
The philosopher kings represent reason, guiding the city with wisdom and knowledge.
So justice in the city means that everyone is doing what they're best suited for.
And working together in harmony.
It's a fascinating concept. But it raises some questions. What about individual freedom? Does everyone just blindly accept their assigned role?
That's a key question. It's been debated for centuries. Some critics argue that Plato's Republic sacrifices individual liberty for the sake of the collective good, but Plato would argue that true freedom doesn't come from pursuing whatever desires we happen to have.
So it's not about doing whatever we want whenever we want.
Exactly. He believed that true freedom comes from living a virtuous life, guided by reason. And when each individual is fulfilling their potential, contributing to the well-being of the whole, that's when true justice is achieved.
It's a very different way of looking at freedom than we're used to in our modern individualistic society.
Mm.
But let's go back to the philosopher kings for a moment.
Yeah, sure.
If they're the ones guiding the city towards justice, how do they acquire this knowledge? How do they learn to see beyond the shadows?
This is where education comes in. Plato believed that education was absolutely crucial, not just for the philosopher kings, but for all citizens.
So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures.
Not at all. For Plato, education was about much more than that. It was about training the mind to think critically, to question assumptions, to distinguish between appearance and reality. It was a process of cultivating reason, of helping individuals to understand the forms, and to live a life guided by those eternal truths.
And this education starts at a young age, right?
Yeah.
Plato has some pretty specific ideas about how children should be raised in the Republic.
He did. Remember, he advocated for a communal upbringing for the guardians,
Right.
where children would be raised together without knowing their biological parents. This was partly to ensure their complete loyalty to the state, but also to create an environment where they could be educated according to the principles of the Republic.
So they're being molded from a young age to become virtuous citizens.
Exactly. He believed that education shouldn't just be about acquiring knowledge, but about shaping character, about instilling the values and virtues that would make them good rulers and good citizens. And he emphasized certain subjects as being particularly important for this kind of education.
Which subjects were those?
Mathematics, for one.
Okay.
He believed that studying mathematics helped to train the mind in logical thinking and abstract reasoning.
Right.
He also emphasized music and gymnastics, believing that they helped to cultivate both the mind and body. And of course, philosophy, the love of wisdom, was at the core of his educational program.
It sounds like a very rigorous education, focused on developing both intellectual and moral excellence.
It was. But the ultimate goal was to help individuals to see beyond the shadows, to understand the forms, and to live a life guided by reason and virtue.
It's a powerful idea that education can be such a transformative force, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole.
It is.
But I think one of the most powerful metaphors Plato uses to illustrate this idea of seeing beyond the shadows is his famous allegory of the cave. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Of course. The allegory of the cave is one of the most famous and enduring passages in the Republic. It's a story that describes a group of people who have lived chained in a cave their entire lives, facing a blank wall.
Chained in a cave. That doesn't sound very pleasant.
No, it's not meant to be. It's a metaphor for the human condition, for the way that we can be trapped by our limited perceptions and beliefs. All these prisoners have ever seen are shadows projected onto the wall, cast by objects passing in front of a fire behind them. They mistake these shadows for reality.
So they're living in a world of illusions, unaware of the true nature of things.
Exactly. Now imagine one prisoner breaks free from his chains and escapes the cave.
Okay.
He emerges into the sunlight, blinded at first, but gradually adjusting to the brilliance of the real world. He sees actual objects, not just shadows, and is amazed by the beauty and complexity of what he discovers.
I can only imagine the sense of awe and wonder. It's like suddenly realizing that everything you thought you knew was wrong.
Yes, it's a profound experience. The escaped prisoner represents the philosopher, the one who seeks knowledge, enlightenment, beyond the limitations of our everyday senses and assumptions.
So he's like the philosopher king, who's able to see the forms.
The true reality that lies beyond the shadows.
Yes.
But here's where the story gets really interesting. The escaped prisoner feels compelled to return to the cave.
To share his newfound knowledge with the others.
Yes. But I bet they don't believe him, do they?
They've never seen the outside world.
They probably think he's crazy. That's exactly what happens. The prisoners, blinded by the darkness and accustomed to the shadows, can't comprehend what he's talking about. They mock him, reject his stories, and even threaten him.
It's a tragic but all too familiar story. The person who sees things differently is often met with resistance and disbelief.
Yes, it is. But for Plato, it's a crucial part of the journey towards knowledge and enlightenment. The philosopher, the seeker of truth, must be willing to face this resistance, to challenge conventional wisdom, and to share his insights, even if they're met with hostility.
So the allegory of the cave isn't just about individual enlightenment.
No.
It's about the challenges of sharing that knowledge with others.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that the pursuit of truth can be difficult, even dangerous,
Mm.
and that those who seek it may face opposition and persecution.
It makes you wonder if Plato himself faced this kind of resistance when he was writing the Republic. I mean, his ideas were so radical for his time.
It's certainly possible, and it's a question that's relevant even today, right? How do we create a society where people are open to new ideas, where they're willing to question their assumptions and to engage in thoughtful debate?
Those are big questions.
Yeah.
But I think Plato gives us a powerful framework for starting that conversation.
He does. And the allegory of the cave, with its stark imagery and profound message, continues to resonate with readers centuries later.
It does.
It's a reminder that there's always more to learn, more to discover.
And that the pursuit of knowledge, though challenging, is ultimately the path to a more fulfilling and meaningful life.
Exactly.
And speaking of challenging, I think it's time we address some of the criticisms that have been leveled against Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
Because as fascinating as his vision is, it's not without its flaws.
You're right. I mean, it has been both praised and criticized for centuries. And some of the most common criticisms focus on the potential for authoritarianism, the suppression of individual rights, and the practicality of his proposals.
So let's dive into those criticisms, starting with the issue of authoritarianism.
Sure.
Some critics argue that Plato's Republic, with its emphasis on a ruling class of philosopher kings, could easily lead to tyranny.
It's a valid concern. After all, who decides who these philosopher kings are?
And what's to stop them from abusing their power?
Right. Well, Plato tries to address this by emphasizing the rigorous education and selection process for the guardians.
Oh,
He argues that they would be carefully chosen and trained to be wise, just, and selfless rulers.
so they're not just grabbing power. They're being meticulously prepared for it. But even with the best intentions, isn't there still a risk of corruption? I mean, power can be very seductive, even for those who start out with noble goals.
That's true, and that's why Plato's Republic has often been criticized for lacking sufficient checks and balances on the power of the rulers.
So in a modern democracy, we have systems in place to prevent any one person or group from having too much power.
Right, we have elections, a free press, an independent judiciary.
These are all mechanisms that are meant to hold those in power accountable.
Exactly, and those are all things that are missing from Plato's Republic.
So Plato seems to just trust that the philosopher kings, because of their wisdom and virtue, will always act in the best interests of the city.
He does. But history has shown us that even the most well-intentioned leaders can make mistakes.
Can be swayed by personal ambition.
Or can simply be wrong.
So the lack of accountability is a major concern.
And what about the suppression of individual rights? Communal living, no private property, no families. That doesn't leave much room for personal freedom.
That's another common criticism. Critics argue that Plato's Republic prioritizes the collective good to such an extent that it tramples on individual liberty. They point to things like censorship, the control of information, the rigid social hierarchy as evidence of this.
And Plato's justification for this is that true freedom comes from living a virtuous life, guided by reason.
Right. But isn't that a very subjective judgment? Who gets to decide what's virtuous?
Exactly.
And that's where the potential for abuse arises.
What if the rulers decide that certain ideas are dangerous or subversive? What if they decide that certain lifestyles or behaviors are not in line with their vision of a just society? Who gets to define what's acceptable and what's not? These are questions that Plato doesn't fully address.
It's a slippery slope, for
Yeah.
sure. And then there's the question of practicality. Even if we set aside the ethical concerns, is Plato's Republic even remotely achievable in the real world?
That's a big question. Many critics argue that Plato's vision is simply too utopian, too idealistic.
Yeah.
They point to the complexity of human nature, the diversity of human desires and motivations, the ever-changing dynamics of societies, as evidence that a perfectly just and harmonious city is impossible to achieve.
I mean, it's a nice thought. But it's hard to imagine everyone willingly giving up their possessions and their families and just accepting their assigned role in society.
Right. And even if you could somehow create this ideal city, how do you maintain it? How do you prevent corruption from creeping in? How do you adapt to changing circumstances and new challenges?
It seems like a very fragile system, one that could easily crumble under pressure.
It does, and that's why, while The Republic is an incredibly thought-provoking work, It's often seen as more of a philosophical exercise than a practical blueprint for governing.
So it's more about inspiring us to think deeply about justice, about the ideal society, rather than giving us a step-by-step guide to creating one.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the most valuable things about Plato's Republic. It forces us to confront these big questions, to grapple with the complexities of human nature and society, and to imagine what a better world might look like, even if it's ultimately unattainable.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Plato's Republic. We've covered a lot of ground,
We have.
from the structure of Plato's ideal city to the philosophical underpinnings of his ideas about justice, education, the philosopher king. But now I want to know about the ripple effects. How have Plato's ideas influenced Western thought and culture? And are they still relevant in our complex modern world?
Plato's Republic is considered a foundational text of Western philosophy and political thought. I mean, it's a book that's been debated, challenged, and reinterpreted for centuries. And its influence can be seen in everything, from our educational systems to our conceptions of leadership, even to our artistic ideals.
That's a big claim. Are you saying that even if we've never read the Republic, we're still living in its shadow?
In a way, yes. The questions that Plato raises about justice, about power, the purpose of government, the role of the individual in society, these are timeless and universal questions. And his ideas have resonated with thinkers throughout history, and they continue to shape our conversations even today.
Can you give us some specific examples of how Plato's influence has played out?
Sure. Let's start with the concept of the philosopher king.
Okay.
While the idea of philosophers ruling the world might seem impractical or even undesirable to many, the core of Plato's argument is about the importance of wisdom and virtue in leadership. Throughout history, there have been leaders who have embodied aspects of the philosopher king ideal. Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor, who was also a Stoic philosopher.
Okay.
Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the United States, deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideals.
Wow.
Even Václav Havel, the Czech dissident and playwright who became president after the fall of communism.
So it's not about philosophers literally running things. It's about the qualities that Plato associated with them.
Exactly. Reason, a commitment to the common good, a deep understanding of human nature.
Plato's Republic has also had a profound influence on our conceptions of education. He believed that education wasn't just about acquiring knowledge, right? It was about shaping character, cultivating virtue, and training the mind to think critically.
Absolutely.
That sounds very familiar. Those are all goals that we still strive for in our own educational system.
They are. The idea that education should be about more than just job training, that it should help us to become better citizens, better human beings, this is something that we can trace back to Plato's influence.
Wow. It's amazing to think that ideas from over 2,000 years ago are still shaping our classrooms today.
I know.
But what about everyday life? Do we see echoes of Plato's Republic in our modern world outside of politics and education?
Well, while many of Plato's more radical proposals, like communal living and the abolition of family, haven't been widely adopted, there are certain areas where we do see hints of Platonic thinking. For example, the idea of shared resources and communal living has been explored in various intentional communities and cooperative movements throughout history.
So, while a perfectly just and harmonious society might be unattainable, there are people who are still striving to create smaller-scale communities based on those principles of cooperation and shared responsibility.
Yes, and I think that speaks to the enduring power of Plato's vision. Even if we can't create a utopia, the desire to live in a more just and equitable world is something that continues to motivate people. And Plato's Republic, despite its flaws, offers a powerful framework for thinking about how we might achieve that goal.
It's a book that challenges us, provokes us.
And ultimately inspires us to imagine a better world.
It has been an incredible deep dive into Plato's Republic. I feel like we've only scratched the surface, but you've given me and our listener a much deeper understanding of this complex and influential work.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure discussing it with you.
And to our listener, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope it sparked your curiosity and given you a new appreciation for the power of philosophical inquiry. Plato's Republic is a book that can change the way you think about the world, and we encourage you to continue exploring its ideas and debating its merits. Who knows, you might even be inspired to create your own vision of a just and harmonious society.